Now, turning to our program, please welcome Kent Laverne, Chief Deputy District Attorney at the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, and thank you, President-elect Saj. Good afternoon. Our speaker today is someone we all know. He's been a member of our club now for a number of years. What he'll talk about today was recently profiled in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and it really focuses on the first 10 years of John Franke's career, where he served this community as a federal prosecutor. He developed a specialty in organized crime, and that led him to become a leader in the prosecution of a number of individuals as part of a specialized organized crime task force that we'll hear about here today. He received deserved acclaim from the Department of Justice for his work in this case, and following his work as a prosecutor then became a Milwaukee County Circuit Court judge here for 21 years. He presided over 650 jury trials, which is a huge number, by the way. And after leaving the bench, then he went to private practice with the law firm of Gass, Weber, and Mullins, where he worked for 13 years. I think it's finally important to note that his career as a public servant has really come full circle here in the last couple of years, because some of you may know that as a result of the pandemic, we have had a backlog of criminal cases, and it's been a real struggle. And John, as part of some specialized ARPA funding we received, volunteered to come back to the court system as a reserve judge, which does happen, and judges do this after they've had maybe retired, and they come back for usually just a few weeks at a time to fill in for a temporary vacancy. When I heard John was coming back in 2022, I was told he'd be here for 6 months with us, which we were really grateful for. What I can tell you now is that 6 months has turned into almost 2 years, and he's still there. He's still at the courthouse. We caught up on a few things just last week. He's managing a full calendar. He's blazed through dozens of jury trials, and he's still working very, very hard each and every day. And I think that's emblematic of his service to our community. So without further ado, please welcome John Franke.
Good afternoon. I hadn't planned, as Kent indicated, on staying nearly this long in the reserve judge tour, and the 650 trials is now, I think, approaching 750. But I'm not here today to talk about that. I'm here to talk about a story that I was involved in for my second 5 years with the U.S. Department of Justice, and my part in this story begins on this guy's birthday. I hope some of you are old enough or willing to admit you're old enough to remember Harry Franke, and maybe even were there when whatever this was went on. Mary may be able to help me determine. I got this picture from my sister who dug it up because it's right about the time of the birthday in question. This is from 1980. I don't know if that was in this room, because I think Dad traveled around with that Rotary Club of Milwaukee thing, and wherever he went, out on his Rotary stuff, he would probably trot that out. So it may or may not have been at this exact location, but it might have been. This is a pretty serious picture of Harry, and for those of you who remember him, he was a fun-loving guy. So here's a better picture a few years later of the same guy. And I know that my story started on his birthday, October 13, 1981, because I was in my sister's apartment in Boston. I was drying out from a 3-week bicycle trip in upper New England in which it had rained on 13 of 15 days, heavily. And after 5 years of working as an assistant U.S. attorney in Madison, I was taking a break to do some serious biking and think about what I wanted to do when I grew up. And my next stop from my sister's apartment in Boston was Lisbon, Portugal, where I planned to bike along the Mediterranean coast and work on my Spanish. So I know it was his birthday because we called him, October 13, 1981. We called him to wish him a happy birthday. He didn't want to talk about his birthday. All he wanted to talk about was this story. The federal prosecutor who had been working for years on the Balistrieri cases and had just returned 4 indictments in early October had suddenly resigned. He'd been arrested. It was a very sad case involving a 14-year-old boy and going to Chicago. And I recall the agents I worked with, the federal agents, had actually participated in his arrest. It was a sad moment for them after all the work they'd put in on the case. And the Milwaukee police arrested Tom Martin, but the FBI agents went along on that. And so my father, of course, somewhat concerned about my career, suggested this might be a good job opportunity for me. He was very supportive of my time off and my biking venture, but this was a special career opportunity, not to mention a chance to get me back to Milwaukee, and a place I had told him I would not live or work as an attorney, certainly not in his shadow. And he dangled the fact in front of me that the Balistrieri's attorney at the time was Jim Shello, who was one of the more colorful and prominent defense attorneys of that time. And my very first trial, or my second trial in Madison as an assistant U.S. attorney, was a 6-week tax trial against Jim Shello. And it was really in that moment, that trial, that I learned how much I liked being in the courtroom, how much I liked trial work, and how much I had to learn about trial work. And the thought of a rematch with Jim Shello was indeed intriguing. But I had already boxed up my bike for a flight the next day, and for me, there was no turning back. So over the next month, as I traveled the coastal roads and inland roads of southern Spain, I had lots of time to think. And I kept thinking about the Balistrieri case, and I kept thinking about this guy, Jim Shello. So about a month later, in a very, very poorly lit room in Valencia, Spain, I hand wrote out an aerogram. Does anyone remember what this is? It's a tissue paper thing. This is, before you had texts and emails. And I certainly couldn't afford to make a call from Valencia, Spain. I was staying in places that were about $2 a night. And I'm not sure I would have known how to call the Department of Justice from there anyway. So I hand wrote out an aerogram explaining why I was the perfect guy for this job. And that if it happened still to be open, and open when I got back, I would be very interested in it. Now, to my surprise, when I returned just before Christmas, after about 2.5 months, the job was still open. Why was it open? Because of this guy. One of the first things Ronald Reagan did was impose a job freeze on all federal hiring. It's funny how life gets you in places you might not get if one little thing had happened differently. And so they'd been unable to fill the job. I went down to Washington, interviewed. They offered me the job but couldn't hire me until they could get an exception to the job freeze, which was not easy to do, and that gave me a few months to go cross-country skiing. This was in January and February of 1982 at that point. And unlike today, when you might be out there playing tennis or golf, some of you remember when we had snow this time of year. So I spent some time cross-country skiing. The job freeze was finally lifted, or they got an exception. So on March 4, 1982, I began work in Chicago at the place affectionately known with a group affectionately known as the Chicago Strike Force, the Chicago Organized Crime Strike Force. It was a rather aggressive prosecution culture, and I still remember to this day a poster on the wall of one of the attorneys I worked with down there. Anyone can convict the guilty. It takes a real pro to convict the innocent. So after a few weeks of this kind of orientation in Chicago, I then moved to what I call a garret office in this wonderful building, the federal building, which at the time had not been remodeled. Some of you may remember that the federal building got pretty old, pretty dirty, pretty crummy place until it was restored. And when I went there, I had a dirty, deserted corner on the 5th floor of this building. And when I arrived, I was very late to the party. The investigation that I now had to learn about had begun 4 years earlier. It had begun in 1978, consisted of an extensive undercover operation, Title III wiretaps, a grand jury investigation, and then search warrants issued at Frank Balistrieri's home, the home of his sons, the office of his sons, the law office that his sons had, and about 5 other businesses. And 4 indictments, as I indicated, had already been returned in early October of 1981. So by the time I got involved, those indictments had been languishing for about 6 months with little happening in Milwaukee other than infighting between the United States Attorney for this district and my boss, the head of the Organized Crime Strike Force. I don't know if Joan Kessler's here today. She was the U.S. Attorney in Milwaukee, not getting along terribly well with the Strike Force chief, and there was mounting concern from the judge assigned to the case about the lack of attention that the cases were receiving during that 6-month period. The lawyers in Chicago had Chicago things to do and weren't really attending to the cases. So how did Donnie Brasco come into this picture? Donnie Brasco's undercover work originally was, of course, all about New York and an effort to infiltrate the one or more of the 5 New York crime families. In September of 1976, so 2 years before our investigation really got going, he was 37 years old, and he was a special agent, Joseph Pistone, and he became Donnie Brasco, hanging out in New York as a purported jewel thief and hoping to connect with New York mobsters. And this is a very slow and painstaking process, as it turned out. And first he developed some relationships with members of the Colombo family. And then in March of 1977, already 6 months into an investigation that the FBI thought would last about 6 months, ended up lasting many years, he met a Bonanno family member, a soldier named Lefty Ruggiero. And that's when things really took off in New York and ultimately connected to us here. And I think I hit the... this is Donnie Brasco in his undercover role. These are surveillance photos, and a lot of the surveillance photos are actually taken by New York police, not realizing that they weren't trailing a mobster or someone connected. They were taking pictures of an FBI agent. The smaller picture shows Donnie Brasco with Lefty in the middle there. And this is Lefty, who was really a fascinating guy. I've listened to his voice on so many tapes, and I may even try to play one for you. He was an interesting mix of Yogi Berra and something much more serious. People who listened to the tapes, and one of the things we worried about with the jury was that he could sound like such a goof. He just was in another world. And while he said things that Yogi Berra would have been proud of, one of the things I remember on the tape was when one of the people he was with were talking about someone getting roughed up. Lefty said, well, a little violence never hurt nobody. And so Donnie developed a relationship with this guy.
Hello. Yeah.
The tapes that I worked with are all gone. I don't know. I may try to find them, whether they're in some archive in Washington or not, but it's amazing what you can find online. And I found an audio recording in one of the many websites I've learned there are about mafia history. And this will give you a little idea of the kind of conversation I listened to for countless hours on tapes. This happens to be a telephone tape, which was relatively clear and good. The tapes that were done in the undercover cars and some of the Title III tapes, the wiretaps, were not nearly so clear. But this is Donnie talking to Lefty. Now, this actually happened much later when Donnie Brasco is trying to explain to Lefty why the Milwaukee guy, Tony Conti, suddenly left and what happened to him.
Hello.
Yeah. All right, talk to this guy. He's got the car.
He's got the car?
He told me he got a call from the Chicago PD about 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Car was found. They towed it in. It was but at the Howard Johnson next door to the airport. The keys were on the floor, and the back seat was out. And he said he's been getting calls from people wanting to know if he's heard from, from Conti.
He's been getting calls?
Yeah.
That was maybe a couple of months ago.
Oh, well, then that's, he didn't say, he said, when. But he said he's got the car. He said he got a call from the Chicago Police Department that they had the car. And if he wanted to come and get it, he said the back seat was out, the car was cleaned out, the keys were on the floor of the car when this is what the cops told him when they found it.
And there's no...
Said he got a call from the Chicago.
This relationship in New York, how did that have anything to do with Milwaukee? It was part that Donnie Brasco's success, Joe Pistone's success in his undercover operation, encouraged the FBI to undertake the rather extraordinary steps that are involved in setting up an undercover operation in other cities, including Milwaukee. And in Milwaukee, the undercover agent was a guy named Gail Tyrus Cobb, who I knew as Ty Cobb. What was the FBI trying to do in Milwaukee? Well, over many, many decades, primarily through informant information, the Milwaukee FBI had developed a pretty good picture of the Milwaukee Mafia, run by Frank Balistrieri, with lots of informant reports about sports bookmaking, vending machine businesses, unions, related extortion, and murder. While the Milwaukee family was in some respects viewed as under or subservient to Chicago, the FBI intelligence, this is from 1963, had already identified Frank Balistrieri as the boss of Milwaukee and also as an independent person on what was known as the La Cosa Nostra Commission. Besides the usual rackets that any FBI or investigation would worry about, there was, in the background of everything they did, a significant series of murders, all of which were believed to have been ordered by Frank Balistrieri, none of which were ever proven or prosecuted. The earliest that I knew of was in 1960. Izzy Pogrub, owner-manager of the Brass Rail, is showing him with Dave Brubeck. I don't know if anyone's old enough to have been to the Brass Rail when it was in its heyday, but the owner was shot 9 times and found in a drainage ditch. 3 years, this is the headline, the rather sensational headline about Izzy's death. There's the Brass Rail next to the wonderful Princess Theater. This is it when the Brass Rail was in decline. In 1963, Anthony Biernat was beaten to death and found in a shallow grave in Kenosha. 1972, Louis Fazio, one of the 5 Fazio brothers, was shot in a parking lot near his home on North Humboldt. In 1975, Augie Maniaci shot in an alley behind his home on North Newhall Street. In 1977, Vince Maniaci was not murdered. Vince was having some car trouble. He pulled in that Fazio's automotive business on Farwell. I'm not sure what connection that has to the other Fazios, but he pulled in and was having some trouble with his car, and the auto mechanic figured that the problem had something to do with the large package of dynamite that was attached to his ignition. At that point, Vince decided the weather in Hawaii was much better than in Milwaukee and went to live there. None of these murders were ever solved, despite the devotion of intense resources both before I came on the scene and including things I did after to try to turn someone who might know something about these murders. It never happened. And despite all of the resources that were devoted, there really had been no meaningful charges or convictions in Milwaukee, with the one notable exception of 1961, when Rotarian Frank Gimbel was the prosecutor and got a tax conviction against Frank Balistrieri, which got him locked up for 10 months. That was part of the job for Frank. They talked about this on the tapes all the time. You serve the time. It's part of the job. So the FBI managed to sell, the Milwaukee office managed to sell the FBI authorities that needed to approve this on an undercover operation in which Ty Cobb, acting as Tony Conti, would set up a vending machine business in the hopes of that a little extortion might happen. Conti obtained the necessary license. There's stories behind all of these things, but I need to move along. There's his license. His fingerprints didn't match, and the police had to be told what he was doing eventually. So we were assured that only 3 people in the police department knew about this, but we're never sure whether that was ultimately the source of a leak later on. Here's where he put his office. It looked much better at the time. This is 1507 North Farwell. There were actually picture windows there in this, and there were some vending machine. He bought some vending machines, put them in the window, and tried to start a vending machine business. And given the general mafia obsession with whether everyone and anyone or anything is an informant or an agent, it seemed odd to me that the FBI chose to set up its phony business just half a mile from the Shorecrest. This is the Shorecrest, so it's just a short walk, and it's not clear to me why they thought this was going to work, because it just seems so obvious. And initially, it didn't work. Nothing happened. Connie went around to known restaurants and bars that had Balistrieri vending machines, trying to solicit customers, speaking to vending machine distributors. He didn't get any business, but he also didn't get any threats. So the agent running the Milwaukee operation got the idea of trying to nudge things by having Donnie Brasco let Lefty know that he had this associate in Milwaukee who was trying to get into the vending machine business. This had to be done very carefully. It just had to be put out there to let Lefty take the bait. And Donnie Brasco was extraordinarily good at that. He did, and Lefty did take the bait. And Lefty really knew little about the world outside of New York, knew nothing about Milwaukee, but he did know that there are certain things that you don't do without permission. And so when Lefty learned that there was this guy in Milwaukee who had money to invest, he also saw this as a mark. For Lefty, this was always a combination of a con and an extortion. And convincing Tony Conti that he needed to deal with the mob in order to be in the vending machine business. And as a part of that, between Tony Conti and Donnie Brasco, the FBI gave Lefty Ruggiero more than $90,000. This was all a part of the cover to play the role of a connected guy, or a guy who wants to be connected, who's kicking money up the line, kicking up money to the soldier, then to the capo, and then to the people above that. And this whole amount of money that was given to them, to Lefty, which he did share with his boss and other bosses in New York, gave life to the ultimate defense, which is that this was just a con job by Lefty, taking the FBI for a ride and taking advantage of the FBI's obsession with the idea that there was this thing called the mafia. So after this connection was made, Lefty comes to Milwaukee to check things out. And much of the time that Lefty spent in Milwaukee is in Cobb's undercover car, which had a tape recorder in it, which was wired, and this produced endless conversations, most of which was complete drivel, but occasional pieces of which were important and certainly ultimately implicated Lefty Ruggiero in his part in this extortion. Now, a week after Lefty's first visit to Milwaukee, we had the murder of Augie Palmisano, which was one of the most dramatic in the series of murders. This was June 30th, 1978. His car blew up, and he was killed. And from that point on, Tony Conti, the undercover agent, got a remote starter for his car. This played into Lefty's hands beautifully, because he could point this out as an example of why Tony Conti needed Lefty's protection, why he was the guy who would give him protection. All he had to do was give him some money and cooperate. Now, as I've looked back over this, I've wondered, did we ever have enough to prosecute any of these murders. The decision had been made before I had gotten there not to, but additional evidence was gained through the course of the investigation. And the question, I look back and wonder, was there enough? There were tantalizing references by Frank to any number of these murders on the various wiretaps that were ultimately done. When Frank says 5 times 38, the FBI believed he was talking about the Louis Fazio death. It was shot 5 times with a .38 caliber. The tapes had these tantalizing quotes, but nothing that would really constitute proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, when we got to the sit-down with, when Lefty ultimately set up the sit-down, the meeting between Tony Conti and Frank Balistrieri at Snug's restaurant, Frank made some statements. Unfortunately, none of those were taped. This was the table at Snug's that was subject to a wiretap later, but unfortunately not at the time. And so we have Tony Conti's report. This is just about a month after the murder. He's sitting down with Frank Balistrieri, and Frank's talking to this group of people, about 8 people around the table. And in reference clearly to Augie Parmesano, Frank says, according to Cobb's report, he called me a name to my face. Now they can't find his skin. In the Title III tapes that were ultimately taken, Joe Balistrieri's heard to say that, in reference to some grand jury testimony, that they made Sam Labrizzi write the following names: Louis Fazio, Augie Maniaci, Augie Parmesano, Vince Maniaci. What is this, the hit list? And then there's laughter. And the laughter is utterly chilling. I'd like to find a tape of that. I hope I remember it correctly. But you know, laughter can speak loudly, and in this case, it really did. But all they're doing is talking about a number of people who have been killed. Now, over and over, Lefty's telling I'm going to skip over some things here. Telling Tony Conti that he needs his protection, and Mafia protocol required that for Lefty to sponsor someone doing business in a city belonging to a different family, Lefty had to reach out to the local family and had to do so through proper channels. And in this case, this occurred by Lefty contacting people he knew in New Jersey, who knew people in Rockford, which along with Milwaukee was in the Chicago sphere of influence. And these Rockford guys would have checked with Chicago for approval to set up a meeting with Frank Balistrieri in Milwaukee. Today we call this networking. Lefty's networking resulted in the critical sit-down, which ultimately produced the evidence that allowed us to bring the extortion charge. And while there was lots and lots of evidence, particularly with respect to Lefty Ruggiero, we never would have had the extortion charge against Frank Balistrieri and Joe and John, really, if it hadn't been for this sit-down, which was not recorded, between Frank, his brother Peter, Steve DeSalvo, John and Joe Balistrieri, the 3 Rockford hoodlums who set it up, and Lefty and Conti. And at that meeting, we really got the heart of the extortion case. According to Cobb's report, Frank points to him and says, "I know all about you. You bought 3 machines, paid cash, got a place on Farwell that's been empty. We figured you was the G. They told me you were a tall, good-looking fellow, well-mannered, moving in with the vending machine business right here in the middle of my town, right in my block. That's why we were looking for you." Frank then turns to Lefty and says, "We were going to hit him. We didn't know what this was about. We thought he was the G." And that, really, without that conversation and Cobb's credibility in relating that conversation, we wouldn't have had a case. One of the most interesting things about the Milwaukee investigation from the standpoint of Lefty and uh, Joe Pistone was how quickly and directly they had access to the main boss. It says something about Milwaukee. It was different than New York, different than Chicago. Someone at Donnie Brasco's level, a connected guy, even someone at Lefty's level, a made guy, would never sit down with the boss of a city, at least not that quickly, if ever. Typically, this would have been an underboss or a captain or someone of lower rank who would do the initial meeting. And Joe Pistone was just baffled at how quickly they were able to get access to Frank Balistrieri in a very, very direct and personal way. And Lefty and Joe Pistone were even more surprised when the three of them were invited to Frank's house for a wonderful Italian dinner prepared by Frank's wife, Antonina. And these are the kind of meetings where you hope to pick up all sorts of tidbits if you listen carefully and you wait patiently, knowing that you may never ask. Don't ask questions. Don't push anything. Wait for something to be said. But to have that kind of meeting at the level of a mob boss was basically unheard of to both Lefty and Joe Pistone, and Lefty couldn't have been more excited about it. So the question was, well, why? Is it just that Milwaukee's a smaller town? Why did they have that kind of access that quickly? And to understand why Milwaukee was different than New York or Chicago in that regard, you've got to take a look at some of the Milwaukee history. And Frank Balistrieri was not the most popular boss. He'd only got the job traditionally, married the boss's daughter, and he became the mob boss. The various murders that we went through, and informants talked about this, did not make him more popular. In fact, there was a lot of anger, a lot of resentment in the Italian community as well as within the mafia community in Milwaukee over why these murders had to occur. And so he had a lot of resentment because of that, and partly perhaps for that reason, he had a very small crew. Remember early in my work trying to absorb all of this, the FBI showed me a list of all the believed made members in Milwaukee, and unlike other cities, even Kansas City or Cleveland our size, cities our size, there were very few. I think there were only about 15 or 16. And I looked at the list and I said, do you have the birth dates for these guys? It turned out their average age was about 72. So Frank did not have much of a crew, and he didn't have a very young crew. And so Donnie Brasco and Joe Pistone and Tony Conti were just what Frank needed. And it was very clear that he brought them in. He wanted them there. He took them out in public. He took them to an event at the Italian Community Center to show off this new young talent that he had. And so they got access at a level that would never have happened in a different setting. Now, after the sit-down, when Tony Conti was threatened, he was turned over to John and Joe, the lawyers who drafted up a option agreement. This was the subject of extensive debate and discussion at trial. We contended it reflected the Balistrieri control over a business owned in someone else's name, which was their common practice in vending machine businesses and in restaurants and just about anything else they did. And my argument at trial and then at sentencing with respect to John and Joe was, while we didn't have them on tape, they talked to Tony Conti, recorded conversations endlessly. It was all about business. They never said anything that was very incriminating. But the overall evidence we had to argue showed that what they did, and this is from a brief I wrote for sentencing, they have long served as their father's advisors, confidants, and in many instances fronts for his various ownerships and activities, both legal and illegal. Their role was and is to provide a legitimate face for the underlying illegitimacy, to be lawyers for their father and his associates, to serve as messengers, sign contracts, operate businesses, and perform a variety of tasks necessary for the continuation and protection of the Balistrieri crime group in Milwaukee. That was the role that John and Joe played as we argued it, but then of critical importance to the gambling case was that Frank wanted Joe Pistone. He wanted him here, Donnie Brasco here in Milwaukee, and through intermediaries offered him the job of running his gambling business. For a variety of reasons, both personal and because he needed to continue his work in New York, Donnie Brasco had to turn down that offer. But just to the fact of the offer was essentially what allowed us to get the evidence that not only would convict the people who actually ran the sports book itself, but to convict Frank Balistrieri and his underboss, Steve DeSalvo, as being involved in that illegal gambling operation. I've skipped over a lot of the investigation. I was going to show you some clips from the movie, but I can tell you that you don't get a witness like Joe Pistone very often in life. This is from an interview he did in Texas, only about 5 years or 6 years after the trial. He had left. He was still hidden, but he did this interview, and I'm going to play it just to give you an idea of how he presented himself. I'm not sure the audio is coordinated, but this was the witness who carried the day in both the gambling and the extortion trials.
And the stolen goods or materials. And I was asked if I would do the undercover work, primarily because the individuals who we were going to target were the Italian mafia, and I was Italian, and plus the fact I had a good working background on the mafia. So after a lot of preparation, background, gathering materials, I started the operation. And the initial preparation took a couple months. It entailed getting a driver's license in the name of Donnie Brasco. That's the individual who I was going to portray, an apartment, some credit cards, and we targeted some bars and restaurants in the New York City area that we knew these individuals frequented. And my job was to try to make contact with these individuals and get close to them to gather information of evidentiary value for prosecution.
He just oozed credibility in front of the jury. Tony Conti had, for a variety of reasons, had some credibility issues, but I think the jury just ate up whatever Joe Pistone told them. I had to spend a lot of time with both of these guys in preparing for trial. We had the two trials, the gambling and the extortion case. There were at least 4 prep sessions, and at that time, Joe Pistone was one of the most heavily guarded people in America, it seemed. I would not know where I was going until I got to the airport gate with the FBI agents I worked with. And then when I saw the gate, I would know where we were going. We met in Nashville, San Diego, Tampa, and then to be close to trial preparation, close to trial for Milwaukee, so the agents would be close in the 2 trials they testified in. We met at Lake Lawn Lodge. And I spent 2 or 3 days each time going over the extensive reports and wiretaps and transcripts that we had. In preparation for trial, I'm going to skip ahead here. I can't tell you how many hours I spent listening to this type of equipment. Some of you will recognize this reel-to-reel tape. Everything that was taped was ultimately put on these reel-to-reels. These were undercover car tapes, undercover briefcase tapes, recorded phone conversations, and then the Title III wiretaps. And the process that I had to go through was to listen to this and decide what in all these hours and hours of testimony can we cull out to make a coherent case and to present something for trial. Now, I've talked about the investigation. I've had to cut short the trial stories themselves, but I want to just tell one that kind of reminded me what a Milwaukee story this was. Milwaukee is, as you know, a small town. Lives intersect in Milwaukee, especially on the east side. It's generally no more than 1 or 2 or 3 degrees of separation. And since 1982, when I first became involved, people have always shared their stories with me, how their lives have intersected with the kind of thing we were working on, the stories about Sally's Restaurants, the stories about where they were when Augie Palmisano's car blew up, the work they did as kids on Commission Row, and on and on and on. And I was no different. My life was intertwined in so many ways with the people and places I was involved in. And then to get to a rather dramatic moment at trial, the gambling trial was set to begin on, I think it was August 29th of 1983. And prior to trial, for really about 2 years, the assigned judge was Judge Robert Warren. And the defendants have been trying to get Judge Warren to recuse himself based on statements he had made when he was the Attorney General about the Balistrieri family. Judge Warren denied those motions, but they kept coming. They kept coming with more information, and I think it was 2 or 3 times the motions were denied, and then another one came in right before trial alleging that Judge Warren had said things at a cocktail party and adding new information showing bias. And so the Friday before the gambling trial was to begin, we had what I think was the 3rd or 4th hearing on the motion for Judge Warren to recuse himself. And finally, after denying that motion several times, we come into a hearing the Friday before trials to start, and Judge Warren ultimately granted the motion. Reluctantly, but he granted it. And I couldn't have been more devastated to that point because I was sure that a lengthy delay was now certain. And this was in cases that had already been delayed, long delays before charging because the investigation was allowed to play out before the undercover agents went public, so to speak. It had been really 6 years since Tony Conti had shut down his Milwaukee operation. There had been no prosecutor in Milwaukee for 6 months, and then lengthy pretrial motions and debates over the admissibility of the wiretaps and technical defects in the grand jury proceedings that the defendants discovered. There'd just been delay after delay, and now we were looking at what might be another long delay. So Judge Warren grants the motion and says we'll reconvene in 5 minutes with the new assigned judge, who was Terry Evans. Some of you may remember Terry. He's no longer with us. But Terry comes out, and his life was no different than the others. I mean, in terms of intersecting with so many people involved in the case. And the first thing he did when Judge Evans came out on this Friday before the trial was supposed to start was to itemize his various connections he had to the lawyers and the parties involved. He had been a young associate in Harry Franke's law firm. He knew me when I was an awkward high school kid. Both Terry Evans and Joe Balistrieri were outstanding runners. I don't know if they ran against each other in high school, but they competed in college. Terry Evans running for Marquette and Joe Balistrieri running for Notre Dame. Terry Evans went through this litany of his connections, including his love for Peter Picciurio's ribs. Peter Picciurio was one of the defendants in the gambling case. And he was friends with many of the defense attorneys, none of which he said would affect his ability to be fair. I'm hardly listening because I'm trying to think how long the delay is going to be. And then in one of the most dramatic moments in court I think I can ever recall, I hear Judge Evans announce that jury selection will proceed on Monday. He would not reconsider any existing rulings that had been made in the case, and the trial was on. That was the first trial. It lasted for 6 weeks. The second trial, the extortion trial, was about 6 months later and also lasted for 6 weeks. Both resulted in guilty verdicts for most of the defendants, including Frank Balistrieri in both the gambling and the extortion cases. And I'm going to jump through these slides to wrap this up. Both Frank and Joe and John in the extortion case. Did it make a difference? Is Milwaukee any different because of what Tony Conti and Donnie Brasco did and what the FBI did and what we did in these cases? I'd like to think so. Is it a better city? I'd like to think so. Was the mafia gone in Milwaukee after we finished these prosecutions? I can't say for sure, because after I pursued some prosecutions against other affiliated people in the hopes of turning someone on these various murder cases, we got some convictions, but they just decided to serve their time. In one case, we got Tony Pepito, who we believe knew about the Tony Biernot murder, if not many of the others. He went off to prison for 45 years and declined our request to cooperate. I did discover some websites now that track mafia activity. I'm not sure how accurate these are. Some I actually identify who the mob boss was after Frank Balistrieri was convicted and went to prison. At least one of these websites, I don't know where they get their information from, lists the Milwaukee family as defunct by the 1990s. So that slice of Milwaukee life is in the past, I think. But one thing I think you can say with some relative certainty is that after those convictions, after the work that was done, the litany of mob murders ended. And if nothing else, that stopped, and hopefully Milwaukee went on to a better future. I hope I left a little time for questions if there are any.
Thank you, John. We have time for maybe one or two questions for Q&A, but I'm sure John will be happy to stick around after. And as always, if you do have a question for John, you can use this microphone here, and please keep your questions concise and topical.
Quick one for journalists in the room. Retirement parties for journalists in Milwaukee sometimes harken back to those trials and Kenosha and places like that. Do you have any thoughts on the journalists, some of them colorful, who covered organized crime in Milwaukee?
Thoughts on the journalist? What I mostly remember was the competition between the Sentinel and the Journal for headlines. We don't have that anymore, but I used to have one or the other really mad at me because they'd want you to release something on the Journal time or the Sentinel time. And if you're going to file something, they get upset if you filed it, late in the day when the Journal couldn't cover it and then the Sentinel could. There were lots of different reporters. Walter Fee is one I remember. In fact, I called Walter as a witness. That's another long story. At the extortion trial, he was actually a star witness. We had to move a lot of mountains to get permission from the Department of Justice to call a reporter to testify about things that Joe Balistrieri had told him, even though they were printed in the paper. I needed dispensation from Washington because they just didn't like the idea of calling a reporter. Foley and Lardner came in trying to quash the subpoena. So that's the most colorful thing I remember was Walter Fee, who then went off to cover mob stories on the East Coast.
So we, of course, want to thank Harry for bringing this to your attention and getting you back to Milwaukee. And I don't know if you ever listened to your father after that, but how did you feel personally, as a relatively younger person, prosecuting this? Did you have any personal safety concerns or family concerns? And the other thing is, can you confirm that Harry was brought in as a consultant because your undercover communication was all in the form of a limerick?
Was I afraid of my own safety? Yes, but not too much. The witnesses in a case are the most likely to have a problem. Prosecutors are fungible. Now, if something happened to a prosecutor right before a trial started, that could be a problem, but it's really witnesses, and in this case, the FBI undercover agents who had the most at risk. I lived in a coach house that was literally about 400 yards from the Shorecrest Hotel. It was an old coach house a friend of mine owned, and the really old coach house. And the whole first floor was just an old stable area. And I remember one night before one of the trials, late at night, I was down there staining something for my new apartment, and there were big windows all the way around, and it was dark. And I remember looking around at those windows and thinking how vulnerable I might be. So I closed up the stain can and quietly went upstairs. What was the other part of the question? Was I afraid? But also there was another part to it. No, not limericks. Oh, the thing I remember most feeling, I guess, was that at that age, the sense of responsibility. And so much of it was personal to the agents with whom I spent so much time, that what they'd done and the risk that they had taken. And if you don't get a conviction, the extent to which you would have let them down and meant that their work didn't ultimately, this was years of work and years of risk on Donnie Brasco's part. So there was a tremendous sense of responsibility. Maybe the clip was up there for a moment. The Journal really hyped the extortion trial as the World Series of Trials. That was something of an overstatement. It was like a wild card game. But they had a long article, as you show, with the headline, The World Series of Trials. And I think that started to bring home to me the sense of responsibility I had. But when you're in the throes of litigation and the throes of trial, you just move day to day and night to night. And you don't really think about that until it was over. But I do remember carrying a real sense of responsibility for what I was being asked to do, and did the best I could. I think we're over time. So, Saj, I'll turn it over to you.